The biting wind scoured the plains, carrying the kind of cold that settled deep in a person's bones and refused to leave. It was the dead of winter, a season that turned the vast open frontier into a landscape of white silence and frozen breath. For Lynn, a young woman who had traveled further than most could imagine, her worth was currently measured by the meager contents of her travel bag and the miles she had put between herself and a past she was desperate to forget. She arrived at the Ironwood Ranch not as a beggar, but as a survivor. Her small frame was wrapped in layers of worn, mismatched fabric, a visual testament to a journey that had stolen the softness from her eyes but failed to break the steel in her spine. The stagecoach had left her at a desolate crossroads, the wheels creaking in the snow as the driver pointed a gloved finger toward the horizon. "That way," he had grunted, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Don't get lost, girl. The wolves are hungry this time of year." The wind snatched his warning and tore it to shreds before he even cracked his whip. Lynn stood alone as the coach disappeared, leaving her in a cruel expanse of white under a steel-gray sky. Every tree looked skeletal, clawing at the heavy clouds. The silence was so profound it felt heavy, pressing against her ears. She walked for what felt like an eternity, her worn boots sinking into the drifts, until the dark, hulking shape of a sprawling ranch house and its outbuildings resolved from the gray haze. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the wilderness, imposing, grim, and solitary. A man stood on the porch, his form a dark silhouette against the dim yellow light spilling from a window. He was broad-shouldered and still as a statue, watching her approach with the patience of a predator. This was John Mercer. He said nothing as she climbed the wooden steps, her body trembling from the exertion and the cold. He simply took the worn letter of recommendation from her numb fingers and read it by the flickering light of a hanging lantern. His face was a map of harsh lines and shadows, carved by the wind and years of loss. His eyes held the flat, weary look of a man who had seen too much of the world's sorrows and expected nothing but more of the same. After a long, agonizing moment, he made a sound low in his throat, not quite a welcome, but an acknowledgment. "Cook's quarters are in the back," he said, his voice deep and rough like gravel. "Bunkhouse gets fed at sundown." He did not offer to take her bag. He did not offer a smile or a kind word. He simply held the heavy oak door open, a silent command to enter the world he ruled with an iron will and a heavy heart. Lynn did not flinch under his scrutiny. She stepped past him into the flickering warmth, leaving the howling emptiness of the plains behind her, for the quiet, lonely emptiness of a stranger's home. The kitchen was a place of cold iron and forgotten meals. A fine layer of gray dust coated every surface, and the air hung heavy with the stale scent of old grease and loneliness. The men of the Ironwood Ranch, a collection of hard-bitten drifters and weathered cowhands, had been fending for themselves for months. Their culinary efforts amounted to little more than burnt bacon, hard biscuits, and boiled beans that tasted like mud. When they saw Lynn, they looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. She was a bird blown far from its native shore, too small and delicate for this brutal land. They laid bets in the bunkhouse that she would last a week, maybe two, before the isolation and the sheer hardship of the work sent her fleeing back to civilization. On her first evening, Lynn said nothing to defend herself. She simply tied a clean apron around her waist, stoked the fire in the great cast-iron stove until it roared with new life, and set to work. Her hands, though slender, moved with a startling efficiency and grace. She surveyed the meager pantry, sacks of flour, bins of potatoes, onions, and a side of salted pork, and saw not limitations, but possibilities. The men watched her through the open door, their curiosity piqued despite themselves. They heard the rhythmic, rapid chop of a knife, the sizzle of fat rendering in a hot pan, and the gentle, promising bubbling of a pot. The smells that began to drift from the kitchen were alien and intoxicating to men used to campfire slop. It was not the heavy, bland scent of cowboy fare, but something more complex. It was savory and rich, woven with the sharp, warm scents of ginger and star anise she had carried in a small, precious cloth pouch all the way from the coast. When the dinner bell finally rang, the men filed into the main house and found the long pine table laden not with a single pot of glop, but with platters. There was savory pork, braised until it fell apart at the touch of a fork, mixed with potatoes and onions in a rich, dark gravy that smelled of heaven. There were fluffy, steamed buns instead of rocks for biscuits. Even the beans had been transformed into something savory and spicy. Lynn stood by the stove, her face impassive, watching them. The first man to take a bite was a grizzled old-timer named Gus. He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and chewed slowly. His weathered face, usually set in a scowl, went slack with disbelief. Then a slow, genuine grin spread across his features. One by one, the others followed, and a quiet reverence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of appreciative eating. John Mercer sat at the head of the table, eating with the same deliberate, stoic pace as always. He did not praise her. He did not even look at her. But when the meal was over, he stood up and took his plate to the wash basin himself. In a place of such rigid roles, for the boss to clear his own plate was a gesture of respect, so profound it silenced any lingering doubt among the men. Her worth, she had proven, was not in what she could endure, but in what she could create. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the snow. Each morning, long before dawn painted the sky, Lynn would rise to the cold stillness of the house. She would build the fire, her small movements precise and economical, a quiet ritual against the vast, sleeping darkness outside. John was always awake before her, his heavy footsteps on the floorboards above beating a steady, solitary rhythm. He would leave for the barns to check the stock, and she would begin her work. Their interactions were fragments, built of necessity. A pail of fresh milk left on the back step, the glass still warm from the barn, a stack of newly chopped firewood piled higher and drier than the last. She, in turn, would leave a tin plate of food covered with a clean cloth on the edge of the stove for him. For those nights he worked past the evening meal, his shoulders heavy with the burdens of the ranch. They rarely spoke more than a dozen words a week. More flour needed. The gray mare looks lame. Storm's coming. Yet a language grew in the spaces between their words. It was in the way he began to instinctively duck his head when he entered her kitchen, a silent acknowledgment that this space was now hers. It was in the way she mended a tear in his heavy winter coat when he left it on the rack, her stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, a silent act of care. The storm he predicted arrived with the fury of a vengeful God. For 3 days, the world beyond the frosted windows dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the very bones of the sturdy house. The men were confined to the bunkhouse, the cattle huddled in the barns, and the vast ranch shrank to the dimensions of the main house. The enforced proximity was a strange, suffocating intimacy. The constant howling gale outside made the silence inside feel deeper, more resonant. One evening, the main lamp flickered and died, plunging the room into the soft, dancing glow of the hearth. John was cleaning a rifle, his large hands surprisingly deft as he disassembled the mechanism. Lynn was kneading dough for the morning's bread at the table. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind at the eaves, and the soft, rhythmic press of her hands into the dough. He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight, and watched her. He saw the strength in her wrists, the focused calm on her face. In that moment, she was not a fragile outsider. She was an anchor. She was a center of warmth and life in a world gone cold and wild. He said nothing. She did not look up. But the air between them shifted, charged with an unspoken recognition, a silent vow that they would weather this storm, and perhaps others, together. The tail end of the storm brought with it a damp, clinging cold that seeped into the bones and settled in the lungs. 2 of the younger ranch hands, boys from back east who had not yet been hardened by a frontier winter, fell ill. It started with a cough, then a fever that left them weak and shivering in their bunks. The nearest doctor was in the town of Echo Creek, a 2-day ride in good weather. In the aftermath of the blizzard, with the drifts piled high as a man's head, it was an impossible journey. A grim mood settled over the ranch. The men spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with worry. John ground his jaw. the helplessness a bitter taste in his mouth. He could fight a blizzard, rope a wild steer, or face down a man with a gun, but against a fever he was powerless. It was Lynn who broke the spell of despair. She went to the bunkhouse, her expression unreadable, and laid a cool hand on the forehead of the first boy, Billy. She felt the dry, burning heat, and her lips thinned. "Boiling water," she commanded, her voice quiet, but imbued with an authority that no one thought to question. "And bring me the driest willow bark you can find from the woodpile." John watched, intrigued, as she worked. She had the men bring in snow to melt, ensuring a constant supply of clean water. From her own small trunk she produced dried herbs and roots, things she had guarded on her long journey across the ocean and the plains. The kitchen transformed from a place of nourishment to a place of healing. The air grew thick with the sharp medicinal scents of brewing remedies. She moved between the two sick men with a tireless grace, forcing spoonfuls of bitter tea between their chapped lips, bathing their faces with cool water, and changing their sweat-soaked linens. She demanded blankets, broth, and quiet. John became her silent assistant. He fetched and carried without a word, his large frame a steady presence in the sick room. He watched her hands, so small, yet so capable, as she ground herbs with a stone. He saw a fierce, protective light in her eyes that mirrored the one he so often felt for his land and his men. He was seeing a different kind of strength, not of the fist or the gun, but of patience and ancient knowledge. It was a competence that humbled him. For 2 days and 2 nights they kept vigil together, the shared task forging a bond stronger than any conversation. They were no longer just a boss and his cook. They were allies against the encroaching darkness. When the fevers finally broke, it was on a morning so bright and clear, the sunlight reflecting off the snow was blinding. The world seemed scoured clean, newborn, and silent. A palpable wave of relief washed over the ranch. The 2 young hands were weak but lucid, their gratitude toward Lynn shining in their weary eyes. The rest of the men looked at her with a new, profound respect. She was no longer just the cook. She was the woman who had stared down death and won. The ordeal had taken its toll, however. The pantry was nearly bare, and the medicinal herbs she had brought were all but gone. "I need to go to town," John announced, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "We need supplies." His eyes found Lynn across the room. "You should come. Tell the mercantile what you need." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgment that her needs were now integral to the survival of his ranch. The journey to Echo Creek was slow and arduous. The sleigh pulled by 2 powerful draft horses through a landscape of sculpted white drifts. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer a void, but a shared space. Lynn, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe he had given her, watched the stark beauty of the winter world pass by. She had never seen anything like it. The endless white, the diamond dust of ice crystals hanging in the air, the deep, impossible blue of the sky. The town, when they reached it, was a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, a smudge of civilization in the vast wilderness. As John guided the sleigh to the general store, Lynn noticed something strange. Men on the street stopped what they were doing and tipped their hats as he passed. The sheriff, a portly man with a sweeping mustache, stepped out of his office and gave a respectful, almost deferential nod. Inside the store, the proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, immediately abandoned another customer to rush over and greet them. "Mr. Mercer, good to see you, sir. Thought that storm might have buried you for good." Mr. Mercer, not John. The name was spoken with a deference that bordered on fear. Lynn stood back, observing, as John gave his list of supplies: flour, salt, coffee, cartridges. Then he turned to her. "Tell him what you need." All eyes in the store turned to her. She felt the familiar prickle of curiosity and judgment, the whispers that followed her like a shadow in this country. But John's presence beside her was a wall of granite. He stood solid and unmovable, and under his cool gaze the whispers died in the locals' throats. As she listed her needs, rare spices, oil, specific herbs, she saw Abernathy's eyes widen. He had to check a special ledger for some of it. It was then, as the storekeeper scurried to the back room, that she overheard a woman muttering to her friend near the fabric bolts. Can you imagine? Mercer's new cook. He owns every building on this street, the silver claim in the hills, and half the county, and he's fetching groceries for her." The world tilted slightly on its axis. Lynn looked at the quiet man beside her, the man who chopped her firewood and drank coffee from a chipped tin cup in her kitchen. She saw not just a rancher, but a king in a kingdom of ice and dust. She had absolutely no idea. The ride back was draped in a new kind of silence. It was no longer the quiet of two strangers finding their rhythm, but the heavy, charged quiet that follows a revelation. Lynn sat beside him, the knowledge of his status a palpable thing between them. He was not just a man who owned a ranch. He was a man who owned the horizon. She watched his hands on the reins, the same hands she had seen mend a fence, clean a rifle, and carry water for the sick. They did not look like the hands of a king. They were the hands of a worker, calloused and capable. She realized his silence was not emptiness, but a wall built to contain the immense pressure of his world. The weight he carried was not just that of a ranch, but of a town, of the lives of every person in it. Her own hardships, the journey that had nearly broken her, suddenly seemed smaller, not insignificant, but part of a larger tapestry of survival. She felt a deep, aching compassion for him, for the profound loneliness that must come with such power. He could feel her gaze on him, could sense the shift in the air. He had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, a steady, unobtrusive warmth at the edge of his life. Now he felt exposed, as if the ledger of his life had been opened for her inspection. He half expected her to change, to become fawning like the townsfolk, or perhaps fearful. He set his jaw, waiting for it, but she said nothing, her expression as serene as the snow-covered plains around them. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, the left runner of the sleigh caught a hidden ice patch and sank deep into a snowdrift with a sickening crunch. The horses whinnied, struggling against their harnesses. John was off the seat in an instant, his voice a low, calming rumble to the animals. "Easy now, easy." The sleigh was tilted at a dangerous angle, mired in the deep snow. It would take hard labor to free it. Without a word, Lynn climbed down, sinking to her knees in the powder. She began to dig the snow away from the runner with her gloved hands, her movements quick and efficient. John stopped, watching her for a moment. She did not wait to be told. She saw the problem and became part of the solution. He worked the horses while she cleared the path. In the shared, breathless work, under the fading light of a winter sky, the awkwardness between them dissolved, replaced by the familiar rhythm of mutual effort. The revelation in town had changed the facts of their world, but it had not changed the truth of it. They were two solitary souls who worked better together. Back at the ranch, the routine of their lives resumed, yet everything was altered. It was in the small things. The men, having heard the gossip from town, looked at her differently. She was no longer just the cook. She was the woman the boss had personally escorted, the one whose needs he had placed on par with his own. Their respect was now tinged with a cautious awe. For John, the change was more profound. He began to seek the warmth of the kitchen not just for sustenance, but for solace. He would take his paperwork to the long dining table, the scratch of his pen a counterpoint to the soft sounds of her chopping vegetables or stirring a pot. He never spoke of it, but being in her presence seemed to ease the great weight on his shoulders. The vast, empty house felt less like a mausoleum of his past and more like a home. One evening, drawn by a scent of something sweet and delicate, he found her by the hearth, a small clay pot in her hands. Inside, a single fragile orchid was blooming, its petals a shocking splash of purple against the rustic brown of the room. It was a piece of another world, a secret garden she had nurtured in the heart of winter. "It was my mother's," she said softly, without looking up. "I carried the root with me, to remember." He understood. He had his own ghosts, his own talismans of memory. He looked at the impossible flower, thriving against all odds in this unforgiving land, and he saw her. He saw her resilience, her quiet beauty, her hidden strength. It was a revelation more potent than learning of any silver claim. He turned and left the room, and a few minutes later returned. He placed an object on the table beside her. It was a small, leather-bound book of poetry, its pages softened and worn with use. "My wife's," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. She would have liked your flower." It was the first time he had ever mentioned a wife. The offering was an act of profound trust, a key to a locked room in his heart. Lynn reached out and gently touched the cover of the book, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering. In that shared moment of vulnerability, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts, the quiet space between them became sacred ground. The thaw was a liar. It came for a few days, turning the snow to slush and filling the air with the scent of damp earth and the promise of spring. Then, just as hope began to take root, winter returned with a final vicious snarl. A freezing rain descended, coating every surface in a treacherous sheet of ice, followed by a new blanket of snow. It was on the second day of this renewed storm that 3 riders appeared out of the swirling gray, their horses steaming, their faces obscured by frost. The man in the lead was tall and wiry, with a cruel twist to his mouth and eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. John met them on the porch, his body a solid, unmoving barrier in the doorway. "Holt," he said, his voice flat and cold as the ice hanging from the eaves. The man, Barton Holt, gave a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mercer, a hell of a storm. My men and I need shelter, just till it passes." It was the law of the frontier, a code of survival that even enemies were expected to honor. To turn a man away in a storm like this was a death sentence. John's eyes narrowed, but he gave a curt nod and stepped aside. As the men stomped the snow from their boots in the entryway, Holt's gaze swept the room and settled on Lynn, who was placing a fresh log on the fire. His eyes lingered on her, a greedy, appraising look that stripped the air of its warmth. "Well now," Holt drawled, his voice slick with insinuation, "I see you found yourself some new comforts, Mercer, more exotic than your usual taste." The insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The ranch hands who had been in the room froze, their hands hovering over their coffee cups. Lynn straightened, her back to them, but John could see the rigid set of her shoulders. He took a step forward, placing himself subtly between Holt and her. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "She is the cook for this ranch," he said, each word a chip of ice, "and she is under my protection. You will show her the same respect you show this house, or you will face the storm." The threat was unmistakable. Holt's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He saw the look in Mercer's eyes, a look he remembered from a long-ago dispute over water rights, a look that had cost him everything. He gave a short, humorless laugh and raised his hands in mock surrender. But the challenge had been made, and the fragile peace of the house had been shattered. The house became a cage. The storm raged outside, trapping them all within the thin wooden walls, the air thick with unspoken history and imminent violence. Holt and his men took their seats at the long table, their presence a violation of the quiet order Lynn had created. Holt, especially, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in trying to unnerve her. He watched her every move, making loud, pointed comments about the food, about her appearance, his words always aimed at John. He was a master of the veiled threat, the carefully placed barb designed to provoke. John remained a statue of controlled fury, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving Holt. He sat at the head of the table, a silent guardian, his stillness more menacing than any outburst. During the evening meal, Holt began to tell a story, a twisted version of his past with John, painting him as a ruthless thief who had built his empire on the ruin of other men. "He takes what he wants," Holt said, looking directly at Lynn with a sneer. "Always has. Don't matter if it's land, silver, or a pretty little thing hiding from her own past." That was the final line. Lynn flinched, a small, involuntary movement, and it was all John needed to see. He rose from his chair, the movement so sudden and silent that it startled everyone. The room fell utterly still, the only sound the howl of the wind outside. Holt, misjudging the moment, pushed his chair back and started to rise, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. He never cleared the leather. In a blur of motion, John crossed the space between them, seized Holt's wrist in a grip of iron, and slammed it down onto the table. A bone cracked with a sickening sound. Holt screamed, a raw, ragged noise of pain and shock. John leaned in close, his voice a low growl that cut through the chaos. "I gave you my word. You're in my house." He twisted the arm, and Holt cried out again, "Now you will give me yours. You will not speak to her. You will not look at her. And when the sun rises, you will ride out of my sight and never return." He released the broken wrist. The other two men sat frozen, their hands in plain sight on the table. The violence had been swift, brutal, and absolute. The threat was over. John straightened up, his chest heaving, the tightly coiled control he maintained at all times finally broken. He turned, his eyes finding Lynn's across the suddenly vast room. The fury in his gaze was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability. "This is your home," he said, his voice ragged. The words were not for Holt, or the men, but for her alone. "If you will have it." The dawn broke quiet and clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world hushed and glittering under a fresh coat of snow. Holt and his men were gone, riding out at first light with their leader's arm in a crude sling, their dark forms swallowed by the immense white landscape. An almost sacred peace settled back over the Ironwood ranch. The air in the house was clear again, purged of the tension and menace of the night before. John stood by the window in the main room, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the sun rise. He had not slept. He had replayed the events of the night over and over, the sickening crack of bone, the fear he had seen flicker in Lynn's eyes, the raw, unthinking possessiveness of his own words. He had laid his heart bare, not with poetry or promises, but with a declaration as stark and unadorned as the land itself. He heard her soft footsteps behind him and turned. She carried a tray with a fresh, steaming cup and a plate with 2 perfectly steamed buns. She set it down on the table beside him. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes holding a depth of understanding that went beyond words. Her gaze was steady, calm, and in it he saw not fear or pity, but acceptance, an answer. He reached for the cup she offered, and as his fingers brushed against hers, she did not pull away. Her hand remained for a heartbeat, a small, warm pressure against his, a silent vow that answered his own. A new beginning unfolded in that quiet moment. Later, they stood together on the porch, a place where he had always stood alone. They looked out at the vast expanse of his land. The mountains in the distance were sharp against the blue sky. The snow on the plains sparkled like a field of diamonds, and the world, which had for so long felt like a burden to be endured, now felt like a promise. It was no longer his kingdom of isolation. It was their shared horizon. Worth, he finally understood, was not measured in what a man owned, how many buildings bore his name, or what a woman could endure. It was measured in the quiet, unshakable strength of a hand that reaches for yours in the cold, and the profound peace of knowing you will not face the dawn alone. And in the heart of winter, amidst the snow and the silence, a love as resilient as a mountain flower had finally begun to bloom.